I'm going to forget they're there and be looking for them later, so someone help me over. All good? They're right there. Thank you. I'll read them. Okay, who's excited about today? Yeah, good morning, sorry. Good morning. Okay, a few kind of quasi announcements going in. Number one, guys, Reformation Month was incredible this year. Wow. I mean, y'all killed it with the reading. So it was also the first month we technically paid rent on our new space, and we still had a good month, so yay to that. We got by, a pretty good margin, so I'm excited about that. So keep that up, along with your reading plan and other things. We are now getting close to the end of Matthew's Gospel. Some of you may be excited about that, but maybe more exciting today is we're actually going to talk about, fancy term, eschatology, right? Anybody just got that term rolls right off the tongue? So let's just do the nerdy thing we always do. Let's start with some definitions. Okay, so I'm going to throw out some lingo today, because sometimes it's easier just to throw out the lingo than to re-explain the topic every time we say it. So, when I say eschatology, we just mean the study of last things. That's all that word means. Just like there's theology, what's that the study of? Theo, God. We can study a lot of things. Biology, of course, life. Eska is just the Greek word for last. So last, technically it's the study of last things. And so a lot of times in our culture, when you hear the word apocalyptic, actually we use it incorrectly. The word apocalyptic does not mean apocalyptic. We just use the word that way. So if I said something bad was going to happen at like apocalyptic scale, what do I mean?
Zombies.
Like, we do that, okay, that's true. All right, but apocalyptic has this, we use it culturally to mean like global, wide-scale, end-of-earth type event. Major. Really, we should call that an eschatological event. Eschatological, it's just more syllables, so nobody's going to say that, right? We'll stick with apocalyptic. But when you hear apocalyptic, really apocalyptic just means it's been revealed, so a secret. Like, you ever had a secret been outed? That was an apocalypse for you, okay? Which is revealed. That's all that means. But an apocalyptic event, culturally speaking, is more, that's eschatology. Something global, something earth-changing. Technically, we've already had apocalyptic events happen. In that regard, the coming of Jesus began what age in human history? What's the Bible called? The last age. We're in the end now. Now, it's a much longer age than many in the early church expected it to be. But I think we'll see some of that going on in the passage today. So when we say eschatology, that's just our technical term for our study of last things, what's going down. All right, we are also in Matthew chapter 24, which is in the middle of a sermon. And the first sermon we studied with Jesus, he was on a mount, and we call that the Sermon on the Mount. This time he's also on a mount, but it's the Mount of Olives, and we call this the Olivet Discourse. So you hear that term, it sounds fancy, it just means Jesus was on the Mount of Olives when he preached this passage. And so he's not just preaching, it's not like the Sermon on the Mount where he gathered everybody together and preached the message. This sermon, unlike the other, has been provoked by a question. So we've got to turn to Matthew chapter 24. Today we'll be picking up in verse 15 in like 30 minutes. Okay, we got to do a lot of prep work to make sense of what's going on here. So let me just go ahead and make a few disclaimers, okay? Number one, we are not going to fully hash out any version, any branch, any scenario of eschatology today, right? Because that would take hours and hours and hours, because we have to consider a lot of different options. That does not mean, however, we're not going to talk about it. We are. And so I like to preach on hills I can die on, okay? A lot of the things that are going to come up today are hills I don't want to die on. I have opinions on all this stuff, and I'm going to share them with you. I'm going to put this passage together the way I think Jesus is putting it together, but some of my closest friends who study theology and discuss this with me see this differently than I do. Different scholars I respect see this differently than I do. Across church history, guys I love see this differently than I do. None of them all see it the same. It's not like all of them versus me. It's more like all 40 views versus my view. So we're going to dive in, but I'm probably not going to cover every question today. Second disclaimer, at some point, if you've studied eschatology, you're probably going to disagree with me. Okay? So I'm going to tell you, disagree after the service, not during the service. We cool? That's not a confident cool. Okay? I'm hoping we're cool on that. Okay? So you're going to raise your hand and be like, oh, what about Daniel chapter 7? I'm not sure. Okay? We're not going to go quite that deep today, but we're going to set some things. So what I'm going to do is kind of introduction. Is there are elements of our eschatology, how we understand the end, that are hills worth dying. So I want to make sure we know what those are going into it. Because a lot of times people come into Christianity and the first thing they study is eschatology. Go straight to the book of Revelation. I know a friend of mine got saved reading the Left Behind series. And so that's a very fascinating topic, even for those outside of the faith. And so we come in and we study that and we start to make critical to our faith certain aspects of eschatology that are not the hills we die on. There's certain aspects of eschatology that if you disbelieve, I can boldly say and die on that hill, you're not one of us. You are not a believer if you disagree with a few of the points that I'm going to make. And there's other points we're going to make here that you can totally disagree on, and we probably will disagree on. So, with all of that coming into your mind, let's dive in. Matthew chapter 24, let's recover or review what we've done so far. So it started by the disciples who were with Jesus pointing out the temple and saying, this place is kind of amazing, right? They're calling attention to it. Jesus had just told them, after he had given all these woes to the Pharisees, that Jerusalem will be left desolate. And I think in their mind, the Messiah has come, so glory should be here. The kingdom is present. All things are about to be fulfilled. And then Jesus says Jerusalem is going to be left desolate. And I think that kind of causes some pause for them. And they say, but that's a pretty amazing building. And it's the prettiest, most amazing temple has to be yet in time, in history. It's a very beautiful structure. It's been upgraded, expanded. And Jesus confronts that statement with a prophecy. He says, okay, well, you see that building? You see all that beautiful stuff? All this architecture that's been done? They changed the topography of Jerusalem to put this temple complex there. I mean, it's a big undertaking, especially for 2,000 years ago. Major event. Jesus says not one stone in that complex will still be sitting on top of the mountain. Now, historically, we know, we don't have to speculate here, we know that Jesus was correct about that. In 70 AD, Rome, Titus in particular, the future emperor, came to Jerusalem, laid siege, destroyed, decimated, utterly ruined Jerusalem, especially the Temple Mount. And it's still gone. Okay, so it was a very effective removal of the temple. So the disciples hear this statement that Jerusalem, the temple, will be destroyed. Now just remember, in their understanding, they've been waiting for someone to come. And who was that one person that they were waiting to come? Jesus, the Messiah. And the Messiah's here. And what do Messiahs usually do in the Old Testament? They conquer. They kick out oppressors. Study Judges. The pattern there. What's the pattern? Every time God sends someone to deliver, sends a judge, he delivers them from oppression. We see this consistent pattern throughout the Old Testament. It's really the only pattern they have. And now they see the Messiah has come. They've come to believe this. Peter himself said, "You are the Christ. We know it's you. We know you're the Messiah." And so everything that Brady says, he showed up. He's kicking out Rome, and the kingdom of Israel will be reestablished. And Jesus says, actually, the temple's going to be destroyed completely. Absolutely decimated. So the disciples say, okay, can you give us some details about that? When is that going to happen? When will these things take place? And then what's the sign of your coming? Because it seems like, from their perspective, when is Jesus coming? He did. He's there. He's with them. Well, and what's the sign of this glory? When is all this going to happen? When's the close of the age? They're really confused now because they expect Jesus to wrap all of human history up. Right then, right there. So Jesus, when is all of this going to happen? That answers what we looked at last week. So quick review. He said, all right, I think number one, what he's trying to tell them is it's not as soon as they think it is. He says, guys, listen, many are going to come in my name. Now, he already just kind of informed them that he's leaving. They don't get that yet. They have no concept that Jesus is going to leave and then come back again later. They just think he's here. He says, many are going to come in my name. A lot of bad stuff is going to go down. They're going to kill you. They're going to persecute you. The gospel will get proclaimed. A lot of you will fall away. There'll be a great apostasy. And then after the gospel reaches the end of the earth, and only then will the end come. So that first paragraph we looked at is kind of like this broad spectrum answer. They want to know when it's all going down. And it's like Jesus is saying, well, first of all, it's not all going down yet. Okay? There's things that have to happen before the end comes. That's kind of like step one. Step two is tribulation is coming. Now, we made that a big deal last week against Christians, okay? Against those who follow Jesus. That's who this tribulation is for, and it's not tribulation from God, it's tribulation from the world, okay? That's key. The world will hate you. They will deliver you over. They will kill you. And we see this in Hebrews. We see this, in fact, throughout all of the scriptures, that tribulation is certain. We will be persecuted, and we said the gospel will be proclaimed, and the great apostasy is coming. So those are just the variables that Jesus puts out there in that grand scheme, okay? Now, they already have a grand scheme that they're putting those variables inside of, okay? They have a context. They have a worldview. So when you come to a passage like this, and you read it, you kind of already have an idea. So when you read abomination of desolation in verse 15, where we'll be in a few minutes, you've already got this mind picture of what that is, because you've heard about end times. You've heard about the tribulation. You've heard about the Antichrist. You've heard about the beast and the false prophet and witnesses. You've read Revelation. You've seen these things. You've perhaps even read the Left Behind series. You've got certain things in your mind. They do too. Okay? So when Jesus is talking to the apostles, they've got certain things, fixed points in their minds that Jesus is not disagreeing with. In fact, if we were reading John's gospel, Jesus has already taught them by this point a lot about these fixed points. And so let's talk about the fundamentals of eschatology for just a minute. All right, so that's that first section in the bulletin. These aren't from this passage. They're from all of the New Testament. They're from church history. They're in the Apostles' Creed. These three, if you disagree with, you're out of camp. You're not just in a different version of end times. You're not one of us, okay? This is like so important, so basic, that it made it into the Apostles' Creed, to the Nicene Creed, okay? It's that level fundamentals, like Trinity level. It got put in the same list, okay? Go with me on that? That's just a really fancy way of saying, don't disagree at this point, okay? You gotta wait till the second part before you get to disagree. All right, number one, Jesus will return bodily to judge the world. Now, at this point in the New Testament, in the Gospels, of course, we're very early in the New Testament at this point, they don't know he's leaving, right? They think he's come this final time, but after he does leave, they make it abundantly clear that expect him to come back, okay? This is throughout the New Testament, throughout every writer, every different genre in the New Testament, we see this clear expectation. The angels speaking to the disciples who stood there and watched Jesus ascend into heaven. Do you remember what those angels told the disciples? He's going to come back just like he left, okay? We expect that exact thing to happen. We see it consistently throughout the New Testament. And so Jesus, this is a core fundamental tenet of Christianity. Jesus is God, and he is also what? Man. That has not changed. He is still fully God, fully man, and when he returns, he will still be fully God and fully man, okay? He will bodily return. Basic element of Christianity. Number two, there will be a resurrection of the just and the unjust. Now, you've probably heard me talk about this a million times. This is one of my little soapboxes. I love to talk about the resurrection. But just a quick recap. Jewish eschatology, their version was a lot more simple than ours, is that at the end of time, whatever that period of time was, at the end, God was going to raise people from the dead. Now, this is not what happened to Lazarus. This is not what happened to the widow's son in the Old Testament, where someone gets resuscitated only to die again later. So if you think about a timeline, and I got to get this wrong. Okay, so you're living, and then you die, and then Lazarus started over, and he lived, and then he died, right? That's the pattern. All right, but Jesus, however, the first fruits of resurrection, a different category, he lives. He spends 3 days dead, but he does not come back over here. He comes out on the other side and now lives an indestructible life. When will Jesus die in the future? Never. He cannot die, and that's not just because he's God. It's because he's in a resurrected body. Okay? So Jewish eschatology says all of us, that happens to us at the end. That's their version of end times. At the end of time, we raise up, especially the righteous. Now, the clarity of what happens to the unrighteous in the resurrection is it's just not as clear, but for the righteous, for the saints, for those of us who belong to God, we raise up bodily, just like Jesus did. We get a perfect, indestructible, unkillable, eternal body that will live on this planet for all time. If you go back just a few chapters in Matthew, Jesus was having this debate with the Sadducees. Do you remember that? The Sadducees did not believe in the resurrection. They thought that was made up. They thought the Pharisees were wrong on that point. Jesus makes it abundantly clear the Pharisees were not wrong on that point, but rather he condemns the Sadducees for totally misunderstanding the scriptures because they don't believe in where you go in between or that final resurrection. They think both are false, and Jesus condemns them for that. The resurrection is key. He says in John's gospel, Jesus says God's will for me, you can find this in chapter 5 and 6 of John's gospel, that the will of God the Father for Jesus is basically two things: that he doesn't lose anyone that God gives him, and that he raises them up on the last day. Just gave you some chronology from Jesus himself out of his mouth. When does the resurrection happen? On the last day. Read the book of Revelation, you see the same thing. All that stuff goes down, and then this is key. First, Revelation says the first resurrection happens after all of those things, okay? This is Jesus, John, we see it consistently in the New Testament, that the resurrection is the last thing, and therefore it's the first thing of the eternal age. Y'all hear that? So this age then, we can say, has two bookmarks, has two endpoints, has a beginning and an end, and both of those are resurrection. Jesus, when he raises from the dead, begins the last age. When we raise from the dead, it ends the last age. Okay, now we can get into disagreement about chronology here, okay? But the point is that we bodily raise from the dead. That is the key element of the future of our eschatology. That's not debatable. You don't get to work with that one. If you take that one out, Paul would say you've lost the whole thing. You take out the resurrection, you get nothing. The resurrection is everything. That's why we worship on what day of the week? Sunday. Not Friday, and not Saturday, but on Sunday, Resurrection Day. Okay, so Jesus will return bodily to judge the world. There will be a resurrection of the just and the unjust, and the righteous resurrected will live in the eternal age on earth. Okay, that is the plan. That's the three basic components of undebatable eschatology. We don't get to discuss whether or not those things happen. Now, we can argue to some point about chronology, but not whether or not those are part of the system. They have to be part of the system. Okay, debatables. So, finally, it's noon, and we're just not starting the passage. Sorry, guys, it's eschatology. What did you expect? Okay, Matthew 24, verse 15. So Jesus just told them the gospel will be proclaimed. When that's finished, the end will come. Now, so, because of all of that, I think that was kind of the overview. Now we're going to get down into some details. So, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Now, many of you that let the reader understand, anybody got a red letter Bible? Anybody red letters right there? Is the let the reader understand red or black?
Black.
Ooh.
It's red.
Ooh. Okay, there's debate. Okay, it's actually an interesting question. It's hard to say. Now, in my Bible, everything's black, so, I don't have to deal with it. But the debate is, did Matthew add this for our benefit, or did Jesus say it? Now, since it's contained in more than one gospel, it's likely not added by the gospel writer, but rather by Jesus himself. So I think if you had a red letter Bible, these words ought to be read. So he says, so when you see the abomination, let the reader understand. So the reader of what? Not Matthew's gospel. Daniel's gospel. What gospel? Daniel's prophecy. Let the reader understand. The abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place. So, this is interesting, because he says, when you see that. Now, what's that automatically assume chronologically speaking? That it hadn't happened yet, right? Okay, let's just assume. Well, what's fascinating is in Jewish culture, they believed it already had. Okay? So let's back up to Daniel, Old Testament. Just for a second, Daniel was alive when Babylon conquered Judah. Right? And what did Babylon do to the people alive in Judah? Took them into captivity. We call it the exile. Took them into captivity. Daniel went with that group, and he made a lot of prophecies. In fact, a lot of modern scholars say Daniel must have been written centuries later because it's too accurate about everything that happened during that 4th century period of time. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? So the reason you think Daniel didn't write it is because it's true. Wow. Okay, so that's what they say. Point being, Daniel has a lot of interesting prophecies. Anybody read Daniel? 4 different beasts. We got the weeks. Okay, we're not getting into the weeks today. All right, but the beasts, there's 4 different beasts. And Daniel's thing, it's perfect how it lines up with the start of the Babylonian Empire. Then we have the Persian Empire who conquers Babylon. Then we have basically the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great sweep through, and then the Seleucids and Ptolemies, which are parts of that, fighting over the territory. And then Rome comes in, follows the exact same pattern. Right? We see that work itself out in history exactly. Then we get to Daniel chapter 11, which is where a lot of the abomination of desolation stuff comes from, the direct history. We see the same sort of progression of powers, and it's like reading a history book, except it's prophecy. And you can go back and look at these powers and go, okay, well, this is that king. And wow, okay, that really happened. You can go through here, and then you get to this one guy, historically, who absolutely existed, and his name was Antiochus IV. And he goes to the temple and puts up an abomination of desolation. Well, you know what happened historically speaking? That exact event. Daniel said it would happen in the 530s, and in the 160s, so about 400 years later, 4 centuries later, it happened. Exactly like Daniel said it would happen. It went down. The temple was desecrated. And then something interesting happened that Antiochus didn't expect. The Jews, they didn't respond to that well. So when I say abomination of desecration, he went into the temple, sacrificed a pig, which is a no-no, right? In the temple at all, and put Zeus as God, which is idolatry, total desecration of the temple. The Jews, their response to it, historically speaking, is called the Maccabean Revolt. Ultimately, they kicked them out and regained political independence in Israel. It's a great summary. If you've ever read First Maccabees, much of that is about this scenario. They win back their political freedom because of this abomination of desolation. And that's hinted at, actually, even in Daniel's prophecy, that some will rise up and help, and they'll respond to what happens. Go read Daniel chapter 11. You'll see some of this going on. And so Jesus is saying, all right, when you see the abomination of desolation, and they're thinking, that was almost 2 centuries ago. Well, the reader understand when you see it. So we kind of have a double thing going on. We see this consistently happen in the Old Testament. The prophecy of the Emmanuel child. We don't have time to go into that, but that was fulfilled in Isaiah's day. But then there's actually a greater fulfillment of the Emmanuel child, and that was who? It's Jesus. If you study that passage, Isaiah 7, 8, and 9, you can see the double fulfillment prophecy. In fact, there's lots of these in Scripture, and so Jesus is identifying right here that abomination of desolation. You understand? Because it's going to happen again. The same thing in the temple is going to happen. So this is why he says what he says. So verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are on the housetops not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and nursing in those days, pray for your flight that it might not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Right, here's what Jesus is saying. What happened last time there was an abomination of desolation? They revolted, won their city back. This time Jesus is saying, because when it happens again, you better get out of town. It's going to be bad. It's going to be destroyed. In fact, in verse 21, and we'll get into the debate here, but there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, it never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. Okay. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. So, this is where we get into trouble, so I don't have time to give you all the options here. Okay, but what did they ask Jesus about? When is what going to happen? What did he tell them at the very beginning? This temple is going to be what? Destroyed. When's that going to happen? Well, at some point. In times, brings everybody up. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen. Anybody remember what we're talking about? Okay, we'll see. Okay. I don't remember what I'm talking about. That was really some ploy for me to get my thinking back together. Okay, all right, here's where we're at. So, I think, and I'm convinced, that this is the answer to the question the disciples asked. And therefore, the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is what this is talking about. So this is past. All right, here's another argument for that. If you go read Luke chapter 21, which is Luke's version of this exact same story, Luke's version of the same story, he doesn't call it the abomination of desolation. He calls it the time when Israel is surrounded by Gentile armies and destroyed during the entire era of the Gentiles. Well, what does Paul call the era of the Gentiles? It's now. It's the church age. So I think that marked, in some sense, the beginning of the era of the Gentiles. Now, we're not going to get into the potential, but just for the abomination of desolation is a double fulfillment prophecy. I think it has to be. Some would say maybe it's a triple fulfillment prophecy. Maybe there's another loop. We're not going to get into that today, but I'll concede that's possible, okay? Because of the double loop thing, I think that automatically makes it possible that triple loop is hypothetically possible, okay? And if we go to read 2 Thessalonians, I don't think I'm talking about what the man of lawlessness is what happened in AD 70. And so maybe there's a third loop, but at the very least, I think this is the answer to the question the disciples asked. When will that happen? Well, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, when you see that abomination of desolation, it's happening. You better not be there. Because you're not going to revolt this time. You're not going to gain independence this time. You're not going to survive if you hang out in Jerusalem this time, historically speaking. But Titus decimated the temple, destroyed it utterly. There was no resistance. He destroyed the temple. Okay, verse 23. Let's jump down there. Then, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ. Note the then. So I think this is assuming then that we have a period of time following at least that fulfillment of the abomination of desolation. So if after that, if anyone says, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. So the elect are here, and these things are happening to lead them astray. So connect that to the great apostasy that's supposed to happen. See, I had told you beforehand, so if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Where the corpse is, there the vultures gather. I think we have a hermeneutical key right there in that verse, that last verse, 28. Where the corpse is, there the vultures gather. For the sake of time, I'll just reference it, but you go read it. The end of Revelation 19. Right there where it says the marriage supper of the Lamb. You remember that scenario? And everyone's called the supper. Nobody pays much attention to what that supper is. Read the whole chapter. Jesus comes out on his horse. He kills everyone. He treads the winepress of the wrath of God. And then all these dead people all over. And it says, these angels cry out, now birds of the air, come have supper. And eat the flesh of these kings, these rulers, these people, all mankind dead at the foot of Jesus. And that's what's for supper. That sounds a lot like where the corpse is. There the vultures gather. I think what we have is the abomination of desolation in verse 15 marks the beginning of an age. And you see the end of that age marked in verse 28, which is the exact same scenario we see in Revelation. Everybody's dead, the vultures gather, and it's connected to who shows up like lightning. Jesus. Well, who showed up and calls everyone to be dead in Revelation 19? Jesus, okay? This is his return. Okay, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. To me, this has to be Revelation 19. This has to be that scenario where Jesus, like the lightning, has shown up. The earth mourns at his presence because he's there in judgment. He's there in power and great glory for all the world to see. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather who? His elect from the four winds and from one end of heaven to the other. They all gather together. So, Revelation, right after Jesus shows up and everyone dies, the next thing to happen is the resurrection. It's the next paragraph, okay? In Paul's theology, what we call the rapture and the resurrection are the same. When I read the passage, to me it's undeniably clear. So I have to believe, and to me it's the most literal way to read it. Now, there's 100 caveats that we just don't have time to get into. I understand why they're there, and we can have that discussion afterwards if you want to. But for me, that rapture is not us shooting up to heaven, but us shooting over to where? Where's Jesus coming back? Jerusalem. Coming back to the same mountain he left from, Mount of Olives. We're going to meet him in the air. Over there, we got half the world to go across. And I think we're going to go there. And that's the end. Now, how many days does that take? I don't know. Okay? But to me, that's the most logical way to read this. All right, so let's make sure we're filling in the blanks. Remember, we're under the section of the fatables. I get that. So abomination and desolation is a double fulfillment prophecy. The church age will be marked by tribulation. But I do believe a great tribulation is still yet future. This is why I leave open that option that there's a third fulfillment of the abomination of desolation. That there's greater tribulation still yet to come, but the whole church age is marked by tribulation. I think it's cyclical as well. We've seen areas of the world, Africa, for instance, was a core centerpiece to Christianity in the early eras. What is it now? It's Muslim. We lost territory. Right? Europe was the glory center of Christianity. It's not now, is it? No. All right, and right now we can say, America's the best we got. It's going to be China next if we have more time. That's where the church is growing. There's tribulation. It grows and gets killed. That's the seed of the gospel being spread. I think that's coming. And then number 3, the saints will be gathered. To me, I think that's the rapture. To meet Jesus at his return. We'll be caught up in the air to meet the Lord when he returns in glory. Okay, so those are the points. So I came up with 3 more this morning. I wanted to end kind of on a hopeful note. So here's what I want you to see in the passage. So the hope of eschatology. So we had the fundamentals, the debatables, now the hope of eschatology. Number 1, Jesus has risen, and he will raise us on the last day. Notice that last song we sang, What Beautiful Name? I think it's verse 2. Death has no power. Is that how it starts off? The death is the first word. Death keep not hold. There it goes. And that's the part of the song that got exciting. You know what? What gets us excited? Resurrection does, guys. That motivates us. Here's the most important thing about eschatology, guys. The resurrection didn't just happen to Jesus. It's going to happen to you. It's for us. We will be raised. Number 2, no matter what happens, the glory to come will be worth it. Romans 8:18. For I consider the present sufferings of this world nothing compared to the glory that will be revealed. You ever look at life and I don't know if I can make it again. I don't know if I can handle this. I don't know if I can survive what's happening. What let me tell you? The Word has promised and it's proven reliable time and time again that when we get to the other end of the timeline, we're going to go back. It's worth it. We don't understand it now. I'm not sure we'll fully understand it then, but we'll know beyond a shadow of a doubt the glory of Christ is worth every suffering along the journey. Number 3, last point. All who trust in Christ will avoid the wrath that is to come. There's no wrath for us in the future. There's no wrath for us from God the Father. Do you know why? It's all been dealt with. It's all been dealt with on the cross of Christ. The wrath of God poured out on our behalf for us. Wrath of your name poured out on Christ, fully consumed. So when Jesus treads the winepress of the wrath of God in Revelation 19, none of your wrath is in that winepress. It was on the cross. And you will escape the wrath that is to come. Now hear this. People complain about God being so wrathful in the Old Testament. God's more wrathful in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, we can say he destroyed the world once with Noah, only to repopulate it. But in the New Testament, the book of Revelation, it's ugly. The wrath of God to come is indeed terrifying. For those of us whose hope is in Christ, but we wait eagerly for glory, satisfaction, the greatest joy you could ever imagine. Jesus is telling his disciples, I'm going to come back with glory. I'm going to gather you. You're going to be with me forever. That's the joy and hope of Christ. No matter what flavor you take. That's what it's about. That's what makes it so. Let's go to prayer. God, we thank you for today. We thank you that you've done a work to save us, to redeem us. We thank you that Jesus died on the cross, took the wrath destined for us upon himself so that we can be made alive, justified freely by your grace. We thank you for the resurrection and power that will one day raise us also from the dead. I pray that as we study eschatology, as we study Matthew 24, as we spend another week next week diving into this passage, God, I pray that you would help us to make sense of it. I pray that you would help us to find hope and encouragement from it, that we would have joy knowing what is before us, knowing the hope of the resurrection. I pray that you would bless, I pray that you would work. We thank you for all that you have done. I pray that you would continue to move through our church. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to take communion now. I got carried away, okay? I just got it at the moment. We can't leave out communion now, guys. This is one of our key ordinances. Thank you. That's so me. I'm sorry. Well, while the elements are being passed out, and I'm regaining my thoughts, let's think about what communion is. We gather together not just to eat some bread and drink some grape juice, but it's to commemorate the work that Christ has done on our behalf. So when we gather together, we are doing a portion of the covenant. We are doing a covenant sign, a covenant symbol. And so by doing this, we're not re-breaking the body or re-shedding the blood of Jesus. We're memorializing it, but it is something more than that. There's a spiritual truth. Just like when you can have that moment in worship that just really speaks to you, or time reading the Bible, or something really touched you, or just spending time in fellowship and something really moved in your spirit. The Lord's Supper is something God gave us to do this on a regular basis. It's a way for us to receive grace. Now, not in the sense that if I do it enough, it'll save me. We do it because we're saved. You know what I mean? There's a way to experience grace a little bit more. That's what the Lord's Supper allows us to do. So as we prepare our hearts to take the Lord's Supper this morning, I want us to examine ourselves. And we're always clear to remind ourselves that we're not just looking for sin. You look for sin in your heart, you'll find it. There's so much more of it there than you can ever dig up without the Holy Spirit's help. What we're looking for instead is an attitude of repentance. Is that my attitude before the Lord? Is that a humble submission before the Lord? Because Paul dealt with people in Corinth who didn't have that humble submission before the Lord. He said that's why some of them are sick. Some of them, like Ananias and Sapphira, even died because of that lack of submission. So let's examine ourselves. And while that's being finalized, passed out, let's spend a moment in silence, praying and examining our own hearts, seeking for repentance. Father, we thank you for the work that you've done in securing salvation. We come now to take the communion together, to celebrate the work of Christ, to proclaim his death until he comes. I pray that we would be touched, that we would taste and feel and smell and touch the gospel in our bodies today. You've given us this means of taking the grace in a tangible way, God. I pray that we would feel it. We know that our redemption is secured in the past by the work of Christ. We don't save ourselves by taking this meal together. We remember it. We celebrate it. We rehearse it by taking this together. I pray that you would have your way through it as we do this today. Paul says, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you. That the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" In the same way also, he took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." And in so doing, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. I'm going to read the Levitical blessing over us today, and that is how we will depart. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Have a great afternoon.
Is this like music or something?
I don't know how it started.
Yeah, second string over here.
Second string.
Yeah. I didn't think about it. I was like, oh wait, I should probably slide over there.